Yeah, I know. It's Christmas, but it's also Friday the 13th. Now, I want to tell you guys a little bit about Jason. Now, I know we've talked about the movies. We've talked about the movies at great length. But today's story is a little something different. So, sit back and let's get into it.
Now, the time frame can get a little messy for me, but it was definitely either late 1997 or early 1998. I was living in a town called Miro, Louisiana, and I lived there up until Hurricane Katrina. Now, when you're a kid at that age, having friends isn't something you necessarily do upon your own fruition. It's basically when somebody your parents is friends with have kids your age as well. Well, this was the situation for me during this time. I had a childhood friend named Chad that I would go over to his house, and he would come over to mine. It was one of the first friends I had of honestly having consciousness as a human being at this age. Now, this was a typical day where we all gathered up in the van at the time. We had a teal minivan, the typical late 90s looking vans or early 90s looking vans that you would see back in those days. We piled up and went to my friend Chad's house where my parents let us go over to Chad's bedroom where we started to hang out and play video games. Now, I gotta say something. Even though this is the late 90s during this time, it's important to note how influential the original Nintendo Entertainment System was in my life. Yes, the 64 was out by this point, and we got one right around this time as well. But what I remember is one of my earliest life memories was my father coming home one day while me and my brother were up in our bedroom, and he brought us this Nintendo Entertainment System. We plugged it up and played Super Mario Brothers for the first time, and it was instantly something I knew that was going to be a huge part of my life. We had a great time with the Nintendo Entertainment System, and even though the Super Nintendo was not only out at this time, but obviously past its own lifespan, the Nintendo Entertainment System was my video game system growing up, and it would be up until today. It's a system that I always go back and play at least once a month in my house now. So we're at my buddy Chad's house, my parents are hanging out with his parents, and me and my brother get sent to Chad's room to go sit in there and hang out and play video games. Now, he was a kid that had the Super Nintendo, and we would go over there, we would play your typical Super Mario World and a few other games like that most people had. But on this one occasion, I do remember Chad's father coming in the room and had the Nintendo Entertainment System in his hand and said, "Hey kids, we found this in the closet. If y'all want to play this, I'll set the system up for you." So we were all like, yes, please set it up. So he sets up the Nintendo Entertainment System on the black CRT television and then comes back with the aforementioned shoebox full of Nintendo games. Now, if that sounds weird, just know that back in the day, I think it was a thing parents kind of did because it was an easy way to store games and you could slide it under the kid's bed when he's not using them to keep it out of the way. But we used to take shoeboxes and put the video games filed up in there that way. So he came in with the aforementioned shoebox. Now, I cannot validate through history whether it was a Reebok or Nike shoebox, but anyway, he pulls out Super Mario Brothers with the Duck Hunt combo and starts playing that immediately. Now, I decided to shuffle through the shoebox of games. And as I'm shuffling through the shoebox of games, I'm stopped dead in my tracks. Now, what I see is the Friday the 13th Nintendo cartridge. Now, at that point, I obviously hadn't seen any of the Friday the 13th movies, but what I do remember vividly is the character of Jason. He was as big as what would be like Santa Claus in that time. Still is, as a matter of fact. But you would hear about Jason. He was the hockey mask wielding monster. He was the legend of the killer in the woods to me. So when I saw him, I thought this was wrong. I felt like I needed to stop looking at the cartridge. And so I showed it to my friend Chad, and he audibly gasped as well. Us at that age were taken aback by a game like this. I guess maybe Chad hadn't played this, and it was something his parents played 6 years prior, maybe right when the game came out. Call for Chad's dad to come into the room, and he says, "Oh, I remember that." And we asked if we could play the game. He mulled over for a few seconds and said, "Well, let's put the game on and let me see. It may be too scary for you kids." kids. After a minute or so of the game playing, he decided it was okay for us. Even though we were both clearly scared of this video game, we didn't want to show it too much, so we were like, yes, let us play. At that point playing the game, there was definitely a creepy vibe that I hadn't experienced on a video game yet. The thought of playing a video game and giving you the feelings of fear is something that I thought were so taboo. I had never experienced it. We didn't know anything about the game, but we do remember the game turning on, seeing that hockey mask show up, the knife going right through it, and we were just like, whoa. We would try to move around, shooting zombies with those rocks you would get, and hearing that alarm bell going off. Now, we didn't even bother to learn that you look at the map to try to find a house. We were just in shock of the game at that point. But I do remember we happened to walk into a cabin where there were some people in there, and they said thank you. We weren't sure what that meant at the time. Sure enough, we mosey around to this cabin, and there he was. Jason pops up out of nowhere. We all screamed, and we didn't know what to do. He came right towards us, and I don't remember if I had the controller or he did, but we instantly were killed. The idea of dodging something that this maniacal slasher villain was doing to us was unfathomable. So after that, I think we turned the game off and decided to move on. It was too stressful for us at that time. But that memory stuck with me for a very long time. I lost all my video games after Hurricane Katrina, and it was around 2009 when I found the Angry Video Game Nerd that I decided I wanted to get back into the things that meant so much to me. I remember going on eBay at that time and getting a copy of Friday the 13th for around 15 bucks or so. So instantly when I got the cartridge around that time, I played it, and I was flooded with the memories of that time back in the late 90s playing it for the first time. But hey, we've talked about the game enough. Let's go over and play a little bit of it. The first thing you'll notice when playing this game is that iconic shot of Jason's mask dead center in the screen. So with this being my first experience with the character of Jason in any real setting, seeing that knife come crashing through on his hockey mask was pretty insane to witness. And after you press start, you're greeted to some of the creepiest music I've ever heard. To this very day, the score for Friday the 13th for the NES game is some of the most haunting yet beautiful music I've ever heard in a video game. Now, after you go to your main screen, this is where you have to pick your character. Now, as a kid, just seeing these characters, I didn't think nothing of it, but now looking back, it's interesting. Yeah, there's a couple weird names like George in here, but you'll also notice a Paul, like from Friday the 13th Part 2. You'll even notice a Chrissy in here, which is pretty interesting. Now, the record doesn't reflect whether this was intentional to actually have some character names from the movies or not, but I can tell you this. If you are going to play this game, playing with Chrissy is just like with the movies. Typically, the Friday the 13th films had very strong female leads, and as a matter of fact, they're the strongest characters of the movie. Now, with this game, it's no different. The character of Chrissy is by far the most well-rounded character you can play with. Now, you may be thinking, well, what's the difference? Well, they try to put some human factors into this. Some can jump a little higher, some can run a little faster. Chrissy can do both. Getting Chrissy is crucial to start out the game for me. I always pick her 9 times out of 10. She runs the fastest and jumps the highest. Now, as a kid playing this, I used to remember throwing those, what appear to be like rocks at these zombies that clearly have nothing to do with Friday the 13th. But to make a game where Jason is the main attraction, I guess I can understand where you can't have Jason be the only thing in the game, so to have some common enemies in here, they had to get creative. But I learned a hard lesson. I would throw the rocks at them, and half the time the rocks would go clean over these zombies. It wasn't until I was watching the AVGN episode of the game that I learned if you duck and throw, you'll automatically hit them every time. Now, the only downside to something like this is when you do that, it's going to slow you down a little bit because you have to be stopped in your tracks to attack somebody. But when you have somebody like Chrissy, a factor like that is not that important. Now, when that beautiful music gets interrupted by that siren, that means that obviously Jason is somewhere in camp. So what you have to do at that point is go to your map. You'll see a blinking cabin on the screen, and then you need to mosey pretty quickly over to that cabin. Now, the only thing about this is when you leave the map, where you are on the map doesn't necessarily mean you're going to go in the right direction when moving. Even if you feel like you need to go right based on where you are on the map,
You may go that way to learn that you've been going left the whole time. It's not a linear thing, and you need to go back to the map frequently to make sure you're going in the right direction. This was a mistake I made a ton of times playing back in the day, and I've learned my lesson. So once that alarm goes off, move a little bit to one direction and immediately go to that map. Otherwise, you may waste a lot of time. And yes, there's a time limit on this. If you don't reach the cabin before that time goes up, Jason kills those kids in the cabin. Now, there's a lot to be said about the look of Jason in this. It's somewhat of a joke till this very day that Jason is in fact purple. Now, here's what I think this has to do with. I think what they were trying to do was give a look of Jason that would be reflective to like a nighttime setting. Now, that can't be confirmed or denied, but when you do play the game, it will go to nighttime. And when it's nighttime, you'll go into a cabin that has more of a bluish look, the way nighttimes are kind of shown in movies and that sort of thing, through a bluish hue. So the character of Jason with that purple look definitely looks a lot more suited to that design where the cabins are to be shown during a nighttime setting. But in an 8-bit video game, I don't think they were able to change the color of Jason's skin while playing, so they just stuck with the purple throughout the entirety of the game. But yeah, it's pretty funny when Jason shows up during a daytime scene and he's purple in a yellow cabin. Now, fighting Jason is something that's actually really fun, as long as you learn how to dodge the attacks. Now, back in the day, I would instantly die because I would just go to fight Jason and hammer down the B button trying to attack him, and he would come and kill me in 2 hits. It wasn't until I learned that you have to diagonally go down and either left and right to make your character shift positions to dodge that attack by the machete. The first time you fight Jason, that's pretty easy, but what happens is after you go up to Jason a few more times, his fighting gets a lot more sophisticated and fast. This is where you're going to start losing some counselors left and right. Now, back in the day, I had no idea about learning the tips and tricks, like going and lighting all the fireplaces and getting better weapons, like the machete, which actually takes off more of Jason's health, or being able to fight Mrs. Voorhees in the game. I didn't think that was true. I had heard about it years prior, but it wasn't until I went online and saw that you can actually fight Mrs. Voorhees. Now, it's a dead, severed Mrs. Voorhees' head like you would see in Friday the 13th Part 2. And honestly, I've never actually been able to do that on this game because I've never really had the time to sit down and figure out how to do that the proper way. And that's all well and good. That's not really what this video is about, more so the memories of this. But one of these days, I am going to play the game the right way and beat it. There was this one time where I decided I was going to sit down and play the game long enough to where I could beat Jason. But what happens is, even if you master fighting Jason and learn how to dodge his attacks perfectly, after you take his health off the first time, he comes back even better and stronger with a new full health bar, and it is impossible to kill him. So I've never honestly been able to beat the game. Now, I had seen this on the Angry Video Game Nerd, but I almost didn't think it was true until I decided to find out for myself. I was playing the game right when I got it, and sure enough, I went through all my counselors. This is where you see that legendary end screen of game over. You and your friends are dead. Still to this very day, it's one of the funniest things ever. Why the Friday the 13th 2017 game never homaged that, I'll never know. Like, they should have added that at least as an Easter egg. If Jason beats you on an online game and you're a counselor, you would see that screen or something. I don't know why they didn't do it. But one thing about this game I'll say is playing it gives me a certain level of comfort, which may sound a little ironic because the game is definitely a somewhat stressful game. But it's not requiring a level of attention that would seemingly stress you out. But there's something soothing about it. I think a lot of it has to do with the soundtrack. If I have 15 minutes to spare, just putting the game on and hearing that music and running into Jason as a fan almost, or just fighting for a few rounds, is honestly fun enough. I like video games like this, where they're kind of just plug and play. You don't have to beat them. Sometimes just playing it is all the satisfaction you need. Now, there's some great sophisticated games where you want to get through the story, so not only you can beat the game, but go through the story to see what happens next. These are the kind of games I've always gravitated towards. It's just interesting playing this game now, remembering in the late 90s being absolutely terrified by the game. Times have definitely changed. I can't believe that was over 20 years ago now, and here I am years later making a video about that time in my life. Well guys, we have to start wrapping this up, but I had a great time playing this for a little while. Let's go back over to the computer.
Now, you'll find a ton of videos discussing the making of the game and a lot of criticism about the game for sure. To say it's a perfect game is silly, but there's things about that game to me that are just simply iconic. Like the soundtrack to the game is truly haunting. It's one of the best video game soundtracks I think I've ever heard. There's new Friday the 13th games that came out, like the one from 2017, and introduced a lot of people probably to the Friday the 13th films with great detail, even having Jason's look exactly like they did from certain movies. But to me, the original NES game from LJN is always going to be the one that has those core-rooted memories that I still carry with me now as a big Friday the 13th fan. When I decided to do a video about this, it didn't really dawn on me until just now that my first real experience of Friday the 13th wasn't a movie, it was actually that Nintendo game. It's something that I've carried with me though for a long time. As a matter of fact, I think it's actually one of my first core memories of being alive and having memories at that age. I was very young, I was 4 or 5 at the time, but it's something I remember in great detail. It's pretty poetic now when I think about it because of what's happened to me. I ended up becoming a really big horror fan, and Friday the 13th is one of, if not, my favorite horror franchises. There's a lot of things to celebrate in the Friday the 13th franchise. The movies, the characters, Kane Hodder. But let's not forget the original NES game. I think it's something that's really special. It came out at a time where R-rated movies were getting their adaptations for video games and even cartoons. No, that wasn't a Friday the 13th cartoon, but look at other genres back at that time. R-rated movies like RoboCop got a cartoon. R-rated movies like Rambo got a cartoon. It was a time where whatever was going on in R-rated pop culture cinema was somehow still made to be digestible for kids. And I guess you could say the Friday the 13th NES game was a digestible way for kids to experience Friday the 13th in a safer manner. So on this cold winter Friday the 13th day, I'd say if you have the game, go pop it on. Give it a shot again, and just have a little bit of fun. If you're an older viewer that's watching that experienced the game in high detail back in the day, give yourself a few minutes to relive some great childhood memories. Thank you guys for watching this, and thank you for going down memory lane with me, your old pal CHH. Happy Friday the 13th.
Huge giant thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. Without you guys, this would not be possible. To get behind the scenes photos, videos, music, private live streams, and much more, you can subscribe to my Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Thank you to my patrons.